tremendous gales swept the liner from her moorings to crash into the wrecked Paris before settling down on a mud bank. French experts report that there may still be good hope of salvaging the Europa, so perhaps there may yet be a new lease of life for the former pride of the German merchant fleet.
In the early days of World War II, Hitler and his advisors developed an elaborate plan for Germany's premier superliners, Bremen and Europa. Bremen narrowly avoided interception by the Royal Navy after a dangerous dash across the Atlantic. Now, she and the Europa were sent to Voss, where they were converted into troop ships. The liners would play a vital role in the Nazi invasion of Britain, but not by carrying troops across the Channel. Instead, 4 days before the planned invasion, they would join the liners Gneisenau and Potsdam, along with 4 escorts, and sail from southern Norway bound for the English coast between Aberdeen and Newcastle. The scheme was designed to divert British forces away from the actual planned place of invasion east of Portsmouth. But as the Battle of Britain wore on, the Luftwaffe failed to gain an advantage over the RAF. And by September 1940, it was clear that the Nazi forces were woefully underprepared for a land invasion of the British homeland. On September 17th, Hitler called off the planned invasion. Bremen and Europa remained in Bremerhaven, clad in a dazzle paint scheme. Their fates left uncertain as their country burned around them. Germany would never again build another liner that could touch their size, power, or beauty. Before World War I, German shipyards routinely built some of the largest, fastest, and most luxurious liners the world had ever seen. After the war, the country suffered mass unemployment, crippling inflation, and major political instability. The brutal fighting and mass carnage of the war was far greater than anyone could have anticipated, and the Allies blamed Germany. They used the Treaty of Versailles to exact revenge. To replace Allied shipping lost during the war, the treaty required all German vessels over 1,600 tons, half of all vessels between 1,000 and 1,600 tons, and a quarter of all ships smaller than 1,000 tons turned over to the Allied powers. Germany's merchant fleet was all but eliminated overnight. Bahlen's magnificent trio, Imperator, Vaterland, and Bismarck, the largest ocean liners in the world, were all handed over to Great Britain and the United States. This left the pre-war shipbuilding boom at a standstill, and Britain once again dominated the transatlantic passenger trade. Despite the economic devastation, Germany's industrial capabilities emerged from the war relatively unscathed. The shipyards in Bremen and Hamburg survived the war, and while treaties forbade investment in massive new warships, they were free to resume building passenger liners as soon as funding and materials could be secured. This happened faster than anyone could have imagined. Germany took great pride in their shipbuilding abilities, and re-entering the race to build ever larger and faster ships was a major national priority. One of the country's top shipping lines, Norddeutscher Lloyd, based in Bremen, entered the war with a fleet of over 900,000 tons. After the Treaty of Versailles, they were left with only a handful of tiny ships, totaling only around 57,000 tons. Nevertheless, the company almost immediately resumed operations in 1919, offering freight and tug services, as well as day-trip passenger voyages. The company soon reopened its Bremerhaven to New York route in 1920 by chartering former German vessels now owned by the United States. An agreement was reached in 1921 between Germany and the Allies that allowed Norddeutscher Lloyd to retain the uncompleted SS Columbus. Construction started on the 32,581-ton liner in Danzig in 1914, but work was paused during the war. Upon completion in June 1924, she was by far the largest, fastest, and most luxurious German passenger ship sailing under the German flag. The period from 1920 to 1926 saw the company embark on an aggressive mission to rebuild its former fleet. Relying mainly on American credit, the company began building numerous moderately sized freighters and passenger liners, as well as buying back several formerly owned vessels. By 1926, the company had performed an economic miracle, finishing the year with a profit. Eager to re-establish a premier German passenger service on the Atlantic, Norddeutscher Lloyd placed an order in the fall of 1926 for a pair of superliners that would set a new standard for luxury and speed on the North Atlantic. With their new liners, Norddeutscher Lloyd set out to challenge Britain's dominance on the North Atlantic. For 2 decades, Cunard's Mauretania comfortably held the record for the fastest crossing. But after a lull in post-war shipbuilding, by 1926 it was clear that the speed record was up for grabs, and the Blue Ribbon made for an appealing opportunity to demonstrate Germany's industrial might. But speed wasn't the only distinction ripe for competition. In the 1920s, the pre-war liners that dominated the shipping industry increasingly felt outdated as art, culture, and society raced forward. The Jazz Age saw sweeping changes to everything from women's suffrage to music and literature. Radio was gaining traction. Planes and airships were taking to the skies. The gilded decor of the pre-war liner felt out of sync with a society obsessed with progress, technology, and modernity. The French were the first to build a major liner reflecting these changing tastes. The SS Ile-de-France sailed her maiden voyage on June 22, 1927, while Bremen and Europa were taking shape on their slipways. The French liner did away with the pre-war styles and embraced a bold new Art Deco design scheme. The bold new approach abandoned the country manor designs that once dominated the industry and created a modern standard for luxury at sea. Germany's new superliners would follow suit. To achieve the intended service speed of 27.5 knots, Bremen and Europa's engineers, led by Paul Biedermann, embraced a bold new hull design optimized to reduce drag. Both ships were equipped with streamlined Orts rudders designed for nimble high-speed maneuvering. But their most notable innovation could be found in the bow. Since the dawn of steel and steam, passenger liners typically utilized a knife's edge bow designed to cut through the water. But even before the turn of the century, tests conducted by the United States Navy showed that warships equipped with ram bows tended to perform more efficiently. David W. Taylor, a naval architect and the Navy's chief constructor, used this concept to develop what was known as a bulbous forefoot design. It was first implemented on the dreadnought battleship USS Delaware, which entered service in 1910. While the radical design showed considerable promise, most designers continued to prefer some variation of the traditional bow design. But Bremen and Europa's designers had to be bold if they wanted to achieve the blue ribbon, and testing showed that Taylor's bulbous bow could help unlock the speeds they set out to achieve. The two ships were constructed in tandem at separate shipyards. Europa was built by Blohm & Voss in Hamburg, and Bremen was built by A.G. Wesser in Bremen. Europa was launched first on August 15, 1928. She was christened by Inez Glossel, daughter of Norddeutscher Lloyd's managing director Ernst Glossel. Bremen's launch came just 1 day later, on August 16th. Europa wasn't the largest ship in the world when she was launched, but she was close, coming in at 49,756 gross registered tons, with a length of 936.7 feet or 283.5 meters and a beam of 101.7 feet or 31 meters. She was designed to carry up to 2,195 passengers across 4 classes, with a crew of 965. She was equipped with 4 airtight boiler rooms designed to create positive pressure to eke out every last bit of power from her 20 oil-fired water tube boilers. These powered 4 sets of geared steam turbines that drove 4 bronze propellers. She featured a streamlined design with sweeping curves, all meant to convey a sense of speed. Gone were the days of towering funnels. Europa and her sister featured just 2 low-profile funnels each that only barely peeked out over their superstructures, making them appear almost more like modern airships than passenger liners. Construction was set to wrap in spring 1929, and Norddeutscher Lloyd planned a triumphant double maiden voyage. But at 3 o'clock in the morning of March 26, 1929, a night watchman discovered a fire on board Europa. The blaze would dash any hope of a dual maiden voyage and threaten to destroy Europa before she ever sailed a single voyage. By March 1929, Europa's fitting out was nearly complete. While in just a few weeks her brand new crew would soon fill the liner. During her fitting out period, when workers went home for the evening, she sat virtually empty save for a tiny crew of night watchmen, who were mainly there just to prevent theft. Unlike a proper crew who would have been trained in how to deal with a fire on board, these night watchmen could do little but wait for outside fire crews to arrive once they discovered the fire. Meanwhile, the blaze, fanned by high winds, quickly spread throughout the new ship. Hamburg firefighters immediately began pouring water into the vessel, and she soon began listing heavily to starboard. The list was so severe that the ship had to be evacuated at 10 a.m. out of fear that she would fully turn over, but miraculously, she remained upright. She settled into the mud with only just a few feet of freeboard at her well deck. The damage was severe. Water and fire gutted most of her interiors, and her machinery was all but destroyed. The cause of the fire was never determined. Arson was suspected due to bitter disputes between workers and management, but no evidence was ever found to support the theory. On July 19, 1929, SS Bremen sailed her maiden voyage and easily captured the Blue Ribbon away from Britain's Mauritania. But it would take almost a full year to refloat and repair SS Europa. She finally sailed her maiden voyage on March 19, 1930, under the command of 61-year-old Commodore Nicholas Janssen. Despite a rough and stormy crossing, Europa was able to claim the Blue Ribbon away from her sister with a crossing that was just 18 minutes faster. Europa never quite overcame her late debut, and she tended to get overshadowed by Bremen, which captured the public's imagination and the industry's admiration when she began her career 1 year prior. But Europa quickly matched her sister's popularity with the traveling public, and quickly became one of the most successful liners of the interwar period. For a blissful moment, Germany's superliners achieved the dreams of their creators. Their triumph would be short-lived. SS Europa offered an onboard experience completely unrivaled by her pre-war competitors. Paul Biederman envisioned accommodations indistinguishable from the best hotels from any major city. First-class public spaces followed a similar axial plan pioneered by the Imperator in Vaterland, with sweeping rooms that flowed from one to the next along the full length of the ship's superstructure. Her promenade deck started with a smoking room that opened up to the grand social hall, followed by a library and writing room, and ending with a sumptuous ballroom. These were all connected by a 446-foot or 135-meter long thoroughfare. Spaces were fitted out with furnishings that could be easily rearranged to fit a variety of uses throughout the day, from afternoon tea to dances, concerts, and movie screenings at night. All of these rooms were situated high in the ship and lined with massive floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the ship with light. Long gone were the stuffy dark rooms of the past. Second and tourist class spaces were given near equal attention and featured similar sweeping layouts with high ceilings. This attention to detail made the sisters extremely popular with the burgeoning middle-class tourists, who wanted to sail on a budget but didn't much like being crammed into repurposed third-class spaces on older ships. Munich-based architect Paul Trost led Europa's interior design team. While his designs departed from the traditional Grand Hotel styles of the past, they stopped short of fully embracing something as bold as the popular Bauhaus style of the time. This approach yielded a warm and comfortable luxury that avoided the harsh austerity of future modern designs. Wood paneling, soft lighting, and rich textured upholstery and carpeting created inviting spaces that passengers adored. Almost all first-class cabins featured private bathrooms and attached closets, a feature travelers used to find hotels increasingly came to expect. Second and tourist class cabins were more austere, but they were comfortable and well exceeded most of the competition at the time. Perhaps overdoing their obsession with speed and modernity, both Bremen and Europa were equipped with a small seaplane and catapult situated between their funnels. The idea was to deliver mail even faster by launching a plane about 1 day before the ship's arrival. On October 7, 1931, Bremen's seaplane went missing. Its wreckage was discovered 2 days later. The crash killed both 27-year-old pilot Fritz Simon and mechanic Rudolf Volknecht. The accident devastated Captain Ziegenbein and his crew. Ultimately, the seaplane concept, which was also implemented on the Ile-de-France, proved impractical and was abandoned at the end of the 1935 season. The low-profile funnels also proved to be an issue. On early voyages, passengers complained that her upper decks were frequently enveloped in smoke. The decision was quickly made to add 15 feet to their height, and these changes largely alleviated the issue. Overall, Bremen and Europa proved a massive hit with travelers. The two ships carried 12% of all passenger traffic in the early 1930s, and managed to increase Norddeutscher Lloyd's North Atlantic market share by 17.6%. They were seen as modern marvels and set a new standard for the industry, but their success came at a difficult time both for Germany and the North Atlantic passenger trade. The Great Depression led to a serious drop in passenger numbers across the industry, and many legacy liners struggled to fill their berths. While Bremen and Europa had an advantage over most of the competition, Adolf Hitler's rise to power cast a foreboding shadow over the liners. When they began sailing under the Nazi flag on September 15, 1935, they increasingly became a target by protesters in New York, who were outraged by the violent anti-Semitism and authoritarianism of the German Reich. Several high-profile incidents saw demonstrators sneak on board and rip down the Nazi flag, a symbolic act that represented a growing discomfort with Nazism abroad. Soon France debuted the dazzling Normandy, and Britain unveiled the powerful and beloved Queen Mary. Suddenly, there was a wealth of modern options for travelers who were turned off by the hyper-nationalism of Hitler's regime. But before declining passenger numbers could truly impact Bremen and Europa, war erupted in Europe. Germany's superliners quickly became a prime target as the world burned around them. At the outbreak of World War II, Bremen found herself trapped in New York. While the US was officially neutral at the time, it was no secret that their allegiance lay with their World War I allies, Great Britain and France. German ships caught in American harbors during the previous war almost universally ended up in the hands of the Americans. Bremen's crew was determined to save their ship from a similar fate. After a tense few days, Bremen was finally able to embark on a secretive dash across the Atlantic. She ended up hiding out in Murmansk before finally returning to Bremerhaven on December 13th, where she was reunited with her sister. Europa had just departed for a westbound voyage when war broke out. She immediately returned to Germany, where she was used as a naval accommodation ship. In early 1940, both Bremen and Europa were sent to Bloemen-Voss, where they were converted into troop ships. At the time, Hitler and his advisors were planning an ambitious invasion of the British Isles, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Nazi leaders were well aware that their plans faced considerable challenges. The Royal Navy significantly outnumbered the Kriegsmarine, which entered the war with a significantly smaller surface fleet that had already been reduced to almost nothing by the summer of 1940. Their best hope of success lay in establishing air superiority and in drawing Britain's home fleet away from the planned landing sites. An elaborate deception plan was devised by General Admiral Rolf Karls, in which numerous German ships would be sent into the North Sea to trick the Royal Navy into believing that the invasion force would land somewhere in Scotland. While the plan initially only called for a handful of smaller cargo vessels, the ruse quickly grew into 4 separate convoys, led by light cruisers, torpedo boats, and minesweepers. To sell the deception, 4 huge ocean liners would join the convoy, including Gneisenau, Potsdam, as well as Germany's greatest liners, Europa and Bremen. But as the Battle of Britain raged on, Hitler's Luftwaffe failed to gain an advantage over the Royal Air Force. Through months of bombing and brutal air fights, Britain's resolve only seemed to strengthen. Without sufficient air superiority, Operation Sea Lion couldn't continue. Hitler officially postponed the plan on September 17, 1940, and focus shifted to other arenas. This left Bremen and Europa with no significant wartime role, and both liners sat rusting in Bremerhaven. On March 16, 1941, Bremen was engulfed in a raging inferno. The blaze lasted 2 days and completely gutted the liner. Nazi officials were outraged at the loss, and after a lengthy investigation, it was found that the blaze was started by a 14-year-old crew member named Walter Schmidt. The boy set the fire after he was beaten by an officer for not completing an assignment. He was executed by guillotine the following year, one of the youngest people to be judicially executed by Hitler's regime. As naval losses mounted, the Kriegsmarine began searching for ways to acquire aircraft carriers. A proposal was made to convert the Europa into the largest and fastest aircraft carrier in the Nazi fleet. Detailed plans were drawn up that would allow her to carry 24 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and 18 Junkers Ju-87C Stuka dive bomber, but the radical design presented significant challenges in recentering the vessel's center of gravity, and by the end of 1942, the plan was abandoned. Incredibly, Europa survived the war unscathed, aside from the wear of years of neglected maintenance. When the US Army entered Bremerhaven in 1945, the liner was surrendered and handed over to the US Navy on May 8th. She was officially commissioned as a US troop ship on August 25, 1945. After some quick maintenance, she began a series of voyages repatriating US troops on September 11, 1945. She was decommissioned on May 2, 1946, and handed over to the French on June 8th as a war prize to replace the lost SS Normandy. While she was intact, the liner required significant work to bring her back to her pre-war elegance, and she was sent to Le Havre for a major refit. While work was underway, the French port city was hit by a major storm on December 8, 1946. High winds broke Europa free from her moorings, sending her drifting aimlessly into the harbor, where she smashed into the burned-out wreck of the SS Paris, which had caught fire and sank only a few months before the war. The damage was significant. Europa almost immediately sank, coming to rest in the mud on an even keel. For a moment, it seemed that the great German liner may finally have met her end. But when the storm lifted and the ship was inspected, it seemed that she might be able to be saved after all. The Europa proved once again that she was the survivor, not ready to give up anytime soon. Salvaging the former Europa, now called the SS Liberté by her new French owners, was no easy task. It took divers 4 months to reseal her hull before the liner could be refloated. She was finally raised on April 15, 1947, and towed to the famous Chantier de l'Atlantique shipyards in Saint-Nazaire, where she would be almost entirely rebuilt. Remarkably, her engines were salvageable, but her interiors were completely overhauled. The work took almost 3 years to complete. And because the former Europa loved drama, she caught fire once again in October 1949. The blaze ripped through her newly rebuilt passenger spaces, causing significant damage. But it was brought under control and these spaces were again rebuilt. It took over $90 million to transform the remnants of Europa into the glamorous French liner Liberté. Her interiors were completely redesigned to reflect the opulence passengers expected from a French liner. Many fittings and art pieces that once adorned the Normandy made their way into her first-class spaces. Gone was her restrained pre-war elegance, but for the most part these changes were met with celebration. Her yellow funnels were painted the French lines red and black, and fins were added to address the persistent issue of smoke drifting down to her passenger decks. The Liberté sailed her maiden voyage in August 1950. She arrived in New York to rave reviews and the excitement usually reserved for a brand new superliner. She arrived just in time to enjoy the final heyday of transatlantic ocean travel. And for most of the 1950s, she was a beloved way to cross the Atlantic, especially for tourists eager to experience the glamour of Paris. But it wasn't long before French line executives turned their attention to the future. While they were slow to realize the existential threat posed by air travel, they recognized that the pre-war liners increasingly felt outdated as culture and technology raced forward. In 1956, they ordered a modern superliner that they knew would eventually replace the Île-de-France and the Liberté. SS France was launched on May 11, 1960 and sailed her maiden voyage on February 3, 1962. By then, passenger numbers were plummeting. Île-de-France was retired from service in 1959. With SS France wowing the few travelers still committed to crossing by sea, Liberté's days were numbered. She was laid up in the fall of 1962, and while proposals were made to turn her into a hotel for the 1962 Seattle World's Fair, hope soon faded as these deals fell through. The former Europa's luck finally ran out. On December 29, 1962, she was sold for scrap. Almost immediately, she sailed for India, where she would be broken up the following year, putting an end to an incredible legacy. There's a unique poignancy to the story of Bremen and Europa. They were beautiful triumphs of art and engineering, built before Germany's potential was co-opted by evil. The fire Germany unleashed on the world consumed Bremen, but somehow Europa, just like the continent that she was named for, emerged from the war, battered but still alive, ready to rebuild and persevere into the future. While her usefulness soon ran out, she served her passengers and crew with grace, elegance, and safety, before she was cast aside and dashed to the dustbin of history. On the evening of August 30th, 1939, the German superliner SS Bremen, one of the fastest liners in the world, left New York Harbor for the last time. But as night fell and the superliner slipped out of view, the great ship's nameplates were painted over, and she went into a total blackout. Her course was abruptly shifted north. Mattresses and cans of fuel were brought to her promenade deck so she could be set ablaze and scuttled at a moment's notice. Two British warships, HMS Barrack and York, were waiting in Halifax, ready to intercept her. Bremen's radio operators silently listened for any signs of the enemy warships as they sailed dangerously close. If Bremen was spotted, the cruisers could easily seize or destroy the valuable liner the moment war broke out. Then, on September 1st, 1939, Bremen's crew got the news they feared. The German army had marched on Poland. Soon the world would once again be at war. They were thousands of miles from safety. Their giant ship, the pride of Germany's merchant fleet, was a valuable target, and Great Britain was eager to prevent her from ever reaching home. The First World War decimated Germany's merchant shipping fleet. The three largest ships in the world, Albert Bollen's Imperator, Vaterland, and Bismarck, all survived the war, but they were seized by Great Britain and the United States as war reparations to make up for tonnage lost, including the Lusitania and the Britannic. Immediately following the war, none of the European powers were in the economic position to resume the feverish building that characterized the pre-war shipping boom. This meant that Britain's Mauretania comfortably maintained her speed record for several years. But Germany was eager to overcome the economic devastation they suffered after the war. In the fall of 1926, North German Lloyd ordered a pair of superliners that would re-establish a premier German transatlantic shipping service. The two nearly identical ships were constructed simultaneously at the AG Weisser Yard in Bremen and Blumenwas in Hamburg. The ships were designed to prioritize speed over size, with the ultimate goal of recapturing the blue ribbon for Germany. The twin ships, Bremen and Europa, incorporated a radical new streamlined design to achieve that goal. They had a low silhouette with raked bows and short, stubby funnels that resembled destroyers more than contemporary luxury liners. Their designers were obsessed with creating hulls that produced as little drag as possible. Their hull plate edges faced forward rather than aft, and they incorporated a streamlined rudder that was meant to produce better maneuverability at high speeds. Finally, the Bremen and the Europa were the first merchant ships to incorporate the Taylor bulbous bow, an innovation developed and used only by the United States Navy at the time, though today it's standard. The two ships' interiors were a luxurious example of the popular late 1920s German New Objectivity design movement. The style, similar to Bauhaus but less extreme, prioritized function and marked a sharp turn toward modernism. President Paul von Hindenburg launched the Bremen on August 16, 1928, only one day after her sister ship Europa. Though the Europa was originally intended to sail first, a fire occurred during her fitting out process that delayed her maiden voyage by several months. This allowed Bremen to take the lead. She was powered by 4 geared steam turbine engines that could generate 135,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 propellers. She had a cruising speed of 27.5 knots, and it was said that during her sea trials she briefly reached an astonishing 32 knots. She came in at 51,656 gross registered tons, and measured 938.6 feet or 286 meters in length, with a beam of 101.9 feet or 31 meters. She could carry 2,139 passengers and 966 crew. Bremen was meant to showcase all things modern. A seaplane launch was fitted between her funnels that could deliver mail to her destination a day early, but the device was mostly just a novelty built to garner publicity. Her maiden voyage took place in July 1929, and though it got off to a rough start due to fog, she was soon able to come up to her full speed. She reached the Ambrose Lightship in 4 days, 17 hours, and 42 minutes, a full 8 hours faster than the Mauretania's previous speed record. She sailed into New York to much fanfare and celebration. The Bremen and her crew had a fond relationship with the city, and the ship proved popular with passengers. Europa would join her sister the following March, and the older and smaller SS Columbus rounded out Germany's transatlantic service. By 1932, the 3 liners captured more than 12% of the North Atlantic passenger trade. But the rise of fascism in Germany soon put a strain on Bremen's popularity. Bremen's popularity with international travelers dropped after Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933. The decline in popularity accelerated when the Nazi Party introduced cadres of SA stormtroopers on all German passenger ships. As was the case with the German population back at home, Nazi sentiment among the Bremen's crew ranged from quiet discomfort to intense party loyalty. After 1936, all German passenger ships were purged of foreign crew, and SA staff were deployed through various functions including stewards, waiters, and galley staff. The Bremen had 150 SA officers among her crew. Bremen's first captain, Leopold Ziegenbein, resisted the Nazi infestation of his ship, and he refused to end his correspondence with the required salutation Heil Hitler. He eventually elected to take an early retirement in 1936, stating that he couldn't in good conscience represent that party abroad. He was replaced by Adolf Ahrens, who captained the Columbus previously. He was experienced with the Bremen, frequently subbing for Ziegenbein before his retirement. Ahrens was not a Nazi loyalist. His allegiances were primarily to his ship, his crew, and his country. But while many of the party's actions made him uncomfortable, ultimately he followed orders and didn't resist. Though the United States had a large German-American population, tensions rose rapidly due to the Nazi Party's aggressive nationalist policies and rhetoric. It was the express policy of the North German Lloyd Line that, to attract international travelers, Nazism would be downplayed as much as possible on their ships. But the Bremen, like all other German liners, was required to fly the Nazi flag. This made the liner a target for anti-Nazi protests. In July 1935, protesters rushed the ship, tore down the Nazi flag, and threw it into the Hudson. Since Germany at the time had two official national flags, the swastika and the black and white and red flag of the German Empire, US authorities decided that no symbol of Germany had been harmed. Hell yeah. Hitler was so enraged by the incident that he made the swastika the official national flag of Germany on September 15, 1935. Further demonstrations took place on board after Germany's involvement in the Spanish Civil War in 1936, and the Nazi flag was torn down at least 2 more times by 1938. By 1939, tensions were running at a breaking point. It was becoming clear that war was inevitable. On August 22, 1939, the Bremen departed Bremerhaven for her final passenger voyage. She carried 1,770 passengers on board, mostly consisting of US nationals looking to escape Europe before tensions boiled over. A few days into the voyage, on August 26th, the Kriegsmarine High Command ordered all German merchant ships to don camouflage paint and head immediately to German ports. But Captain Ahrens defied the message, choosing instead to complete the voyage as scheduled and deliver his passengers to New York. A message was transmitted to Germany defying the order for radio silence. It informed the High Command that Bremen would continue to New York and then proceed to Havana for safety. The message was a deliberate ploy to throw the US and the Royal Navy off her trail. Bremen entered New York Harbor at 6 p.m. on Monday, August 28th, and docked at her usual spot at Pier 86. Captain Ahrens and his crew intended to depart as soon as the ship could be refueled. The US authorities had direct orders from President Franklin Roosevelt to do whatever they could to keep the valuable liner in New York. By late August 1933, the United States was well aware that war was all but certain in Europe. From the outset, the United States was officially neutral, and the American public was fiercely isolationist, with only 8% of the population in favor of joining the war even by July of 1940. Nevertheless, the government was dedicated to quietly supporting their allies, and coordinated closely with the Royal Navy. President Franklin Roosevelt, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson during World War I, was keenly aware of the very real threat Germany could pose in the Atlantic. He remembered Germany's conversion of the passenger liner SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse to an auxiliary cruiser in World War I. There was genuine concern that powerful liners like Bremen could be quickly armed and pose a major threat to US merchant shipping as they transported vital supplies to Europe. Intelligence reports even suggested that ships like Bremen had armaments hidden in unlikely places, such as the floor beneath her pool. The concern was that once war was declared, the crew would quickly arm the ship at sea and wreak havoc on unprepared US ships within hours. Whether or not these suspicions were true, it was clearly to the Royal Navy's advantage to reduce German naval tonnage, or, better yet, reserve the ship in New York until she could be requisitioned for the Allied war effort. After all, Roosevelt was always confident that the United States would eventually be pulled into the war. So when the Bremen docked at Pier 86, US authorities were ordered by Roosevelt himself to delay her departure as long as possible. This was tricky because war had yet to be declared, so the US had no reason to keep the ship from leaving long term. So they got creative. New York Harbor was known for efficient turnarounds, but when the Bremen requested refueling, the process just happened to be delayed. Authorities conducted extensive searches of the ship, looking for any evidence of hidden armaments. They dug out the process by taking several long coffee and lunch breaks. Bremen was also required to demonstrate her compliance with US safety regulations, even though the ship intended to leave New York without any passengers. Every life jacket was inspected, and all 26 of her motorized lifeboats had to be lowered to demonstrate that they were all in proper working condition. The mood on board was tense. Captain Ahrens even considered the possibility that they would have to make an unauthorized break for it. But an unguided departure from the busy New York Harbor would have been an incredibly dangerous situation. Even if the ship could manage to clear the pier without the aid of tugs, the US Coast Guard would almost certainly intercept them before they could leave the harbor. So the captain and his crew humored authorities as they slowly ran out of reasons to hold the ship. He also ordered sunscreen and other provisions to prepare for a trip to Havana. He had reams of black paper purchased from an art supply store that could be used to black out windows. Finally, on the evening of August 30th, authorities had run out of reasons to delay the ship. The Bremen was finally authorized for departure. At 6:30 p.m., she left New York Harbor for the last time. Her crew dipped her colors in salute and waved a fond goodbye to the crew of the Normandy. The two great liners knew each other well, frequently docked side by side in New York. They didn't know at the time that the two ships would meet similar fates. As she sailed past the Statue of Liberty, her band played the Nazi Party anthem while her crew sang along, their arms extended in the Nazi salute. They sailed out of New York into a dense fog, their destination a complete mystery to the rest of the world.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
After dropping off the New York Harbor pilot, Bremen continued steaming southeast into the foggy mist of the Atlantic. When she reached the outer limits of U.S. territorial waters, Captain Ahrens commanded all topside lighting extinguished, including her navigational running lights. As the lights of the United States coast disappeared into the fog, the ship was plunged into darkness. Lookouts were increased to 26, and after a few moments, Captain Ahrens ordered a new course of 040 degrees. Havana was just a decoy. Bremen took a sharp turn northeast, bound for her home port in Germany. As the covert voyage began, the crew was ordered to bring all mattresses from tourist class to the promenade deck and place petrol every 20 meters. If they were intercepted by a British warship, Captain Ahrens was prepared to immediately scuttle the ship. The plan was that once a majority of the crew evacuated in the lifeboats, a designated group of firemen would set the ship ablaze, while another designated engineering party would open the seacocks and flood the ship. The captain, chief engineer, and first officer would be the last to leave. As they sailed off the coast of Nantucket, the weather grew worse. The poor visibility was an asset. making the liner harder to spot by nearby ships and grounding patrolling seaplanes. Crews quartered in the forward section of the ship were moved aft, considering the danger of sailing at full speed with low visibility and full blackout. Soon Bremen received word that Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact on August 23rd. They received a coded message from High Command instructing them to sail for the Russian port of Murmansk. Despite her speed, over 27 knots, the crew went to work painting the entire ship a ghostly gray to help further reduce their visibility. The crew used ropes to lift themselves up her bright yellow funnels, quickly painting them a sloppy gray. They used the lifeboats to paint her sides. Her radio operators listened carefully for signs of nearby ships. When others were detected, Captain Ahrens would abruptly alter course to avoid coming within visual range. As they passed Halifax, they came dangerously close to HMS Berwick, HMS York, and U.S. Coast Guard ship George W. Campbell. Bremen's radio operators took careful steps to track the ships as they silently slipped by. On September 1st, 1939, Bremen got the news that they were dreading. German troops had marched into Poland. Captain Ahrens, remembering the devastation of the last Great War, reacted with great sadness, fearing another war would once again bring destruction to his country. But now his primary concern was getting his crew and his ship to safety. War was declared by Britain and France on Nazi Germany on September 3rd. The crew of the Bremen had good reason to fear an encounter with the British warship. Only hours after war was declared, the German U-boat U-30, having just received word that a state of war existed with Britain, spotted the 14,000-ton British-flagged passenger ship Athenia. She was bound for Montreal and carried 1,410 passengers. U-30 fired 2 torpedoes at the Athenia in the first action of the war at sea. One struck at her port beam. The second misfired. Passengers on the Athenia thought the second torpedo's explosion was the U-boat opening fire from her deck guns on the stricken liner as she began listing to port. She would take 14 hours to sink. 118 people lost their lives, including 16 children and 22 Americans. Though the crew of the U-boat thought that they were firing on a commerce raider, the action was interpreted by the Allies as a sign that Germany had adopted a policy of unrestricted war at sea. The Bremen would now be an even greater prize for any captain of the Royal Navy. Bremen raced for the Denmark Strait. The crew was unprepared for the cold temperatures and took clothing that would normally be sold to passengers in the ship's store to keep themselves warm. On September 6th, as Bremen entered Russian waters, her crew spotted a plume of smoke low on the waterline. She reversed direction and quickly outrun the oncoming warship, but when they realized that it was a Russian torpedo boat, they resumed course and rendezvoused with the Soviet ship. A group of Soviet officers boarded the Bremen and, after some awkward attempts at communication in broken English, a Russian-speaking steward was brought to the bridge to translate. Bremen dropped anchor in Murmansk later that day, having traveled 4,045 nautical miles since leaving New York 6 days and 13 hours prior. It was an unfamiliar port with an unlikely ally, but for now, Bremen was safe. In Murmansk, Bremen's crew had little to do but wait. The port city, though busy with German shipping, was mostly unfinished. On September 18th, 850 of Bremen's crew were sent home to Germany by rail, leaving just a skeleton crew of 70 to maintain the ship. By the end of September, a German tanker arrived to replenish their fuel. The mood in the port city continued to deteriorate when war broke out between the Soviet Union and Finland on November 30th. Finnish air raids struck dangerously close, and the Soviets ordered all ships in the harbor to darken their lights. Captain Ahrens waited patiently for an opportunity to escape the Soviet port. Finally, before dawn on the morning of December 7th, the Bremen's skeleton crew pulled the liner out of Murmansk under the cover of a heavy snowstorm. On December 12th, she was intercepted by the British submarine Salmon off the Norwegian coast. In a tense exchange, the submarine surfaced and issued repeated warnings to the Bremen to surrender. But before any action could be taken, the Salmon was forced to crash dive when a German Dornier flying boat appeared on the horizon, sent by the Kriegsmarine to escort the Bremen. Finally, on December 13th, the Bremen made it to her home port in Bremerhaven. There she received a hero's welcome. Captain Adolf Ahrens was promoted to Commodore and celebrated by the German press. The covert voyage was an unlikely success. After numerous near misses, lucky breaks, and truly impressive evasive actions from her entire crew, the Bremen was safe in Germany. But the efforts of so many ultimately proved fruitless. Over the next several months, the Bremen was refitted as troopship number 802 in preparation for Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of Great Britain. But those plans ultimately never came to fruition. On March 16, 1941, a fire broke out in her wood-paneled dining room, which was being used to store mattresses. The fire spread rapidly through the ship despite the crew's efforts to bring the blaze under control. Soon, Bremen began listing dangerously. To prevent her from capsizing, she was flooded and came to rest in the shallow water of the Weser River. It was initially suspected that the fire was set by British saboteurs, but upon further investigation, it was found that it was set by a 15-year-old deckhand named Walter Schmidt. The boy confessed that he set the fire after being beaten by his supervisor. He was brutally executed soon after. Portions of the hull were scrapped for war munitions over the next few years. The rest of the ship was towed upriver and further dismantled between 1952 and 1956, though portions of the hull are apparently still visible to this day. The whole ordeal was a pathetic end for one of the greatest ocean liners ever built. The Bremen and the Europa were revolutionary and widely beloved ships. Overnight, they reignited the race to dominate the Atlantic passenger trade and rekindled the building frenzy that had been stalled since World War I. They were immensely popular and offered a glimmer of hope for a Germany eager to rebuild before the Nazi Party dimmed their success. To me, Bremen represents Germany in the interwar era. She was built by the Weimar Republic, a country with something to prove and endless potential for a peaceful and prosperous future. A country that would be overrun by extremists. Ocean liners carry the spirit of their nation. Bremen set out with something to prove, and she was truly revolutionary. But her potential was cut short by the fire that her country unleashed upon the world. A fire that ultimately consumed her. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, support the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people. Unless they're not to.